My father was, he is not past tense, but this portion of his career track is, a United Methodist minister, the sort of minister that involves quite a lot of schooling involved. And as such, he had a very, very well stocked ecclesiastical library. One of the books that I got into at an age that many parents probably wouldn't have preferred their kid to get into was A Doctor at Calvary. Now, say this with me: cavalry, mounted infantry, Calvary, the hill that the Nazarene was executed on. Also, Carmel is a mountain, not a dessert sauce. This book was an army surgeon's review of scriptural accounts of the crucifixion and his assessment thereof regarding basically what was medically going on. It also involved pretty exhaustive cross-reference with other historical accounts of how Romans generally went about crucifixion. So you can imagine, I'm sure, exactly how I got myself into trouble in Sunday school. This was not my first, nor would it be my last encounter with what I later came to call the Methodist Handshake. I was responding in a context of parsing of information, that information was being provided to me, and that comprehension and synthesis was expected. That's not what was actually going on. That's not what Sunday school was actually about. What Sunday school was about was learning the Methodist Handshake. And by the Methodist Handshake, and what the Methodist Handshake is a series of informational and sociocultural cues that allow you to signal other persons who are familiar with those sociological cues that you are one of them. It is a means of asserting and defining inclusion versus exclusion. I am inside this group by virtue of I know the password, or in this case, I know the Methodist Handshake. The thing is, once I started looking at things in this way and realizing that that's what other people around me were doing, I realized that's what most people were doing most of the time. That most social interaction, most discussion, for that matter, most textual interaction, was oriented around signaling to others one's own circles of inclusion and one's rightful place within the circles of inclusion of the persons that they were addressing. And once that is established, there is this constant shifting of the boundary and testing and reassertion and renegotiation of those circles of inclusion and exclusion, wherein this collective then discusses predominantly who is and is not within it. Being a pastor's kid who not only spends an enormous amount of time at church, but also by virtue of being part of the generation where you were either latchkey or you were getting brought along to work, or sometimes both, I spent an enormous amount of time in this world. As a child, observing adults participating in this process of defining who is in and who is not, and what criteria are in consideration for who is in and who is not, at what degree of inclusion or exclusion. We're talking about a level of refinement and sophistication and deliberation in this system where you have an entire room full of people whose PhD is in this. And it is complicated enough to merit a PhD. So with this lens of primary information state seeking being inclusion, exclusion, definition of bounds, and establishment of hierarchy, and who has inclusive or exclusive authority within that hierarchy, and along what grounds, and on what grounds that could be challenged. Having that being the lens that I'm bringing to other interactions, the schoolyard started to look very different. Fast forward ahead to digging into Wittgenstein, or Erik Erikson, or Michael Foucault. And this stuff, so much of what they have to say felt very, well, yeah, I know. But this is one of the interesting things, is that we, by virtue of being from the outside looking in, and by virtue of the hypervigilance that's required of being a marginalized group, we have an increased awareness of the power dynamics that are used against us. We have these philosophers that go to fairly extreme pains in order to map out this territory that we, frankly, navigate to a degree intuitively because of practice. But this is where this also gives us a lens into some other more fundamental epistemological structures that do impact us even more profoundly. In addition to the information state preference and social hierarchy of the Methodist Handshake, part of the information that is being imparted and part of what is being asked to be bought into is the epistemological hierarchy by which this can be asserted to be true. The structures of what is and is not true, ordered in such a way wherein when we have to make a selection preference between them, we preferentially select those that affirm this social structure. That is a thing that we have internalized, and that is a thing that is very, very difficult to disentangle, but I think it can be done.